The lecture hall went completely silent, and I remember thinking that silence had never sounded so loud. Professor Marl Osen had just finished saying the sentence that ended every argument in every classroom across the academy. No unaugmented organism can survive on the surface of a death world. He said it the way people say the sky is blue or that ice is cold. A fact so old it had stopped being a claim and had become a wall. Then Grace Whitmore raised her hand. I had shared 3 semesters of lectures with her by that point, and in all that time I do not think I had heard her voice more than a handful of times. She sat in the back corner of the room, always near the exit, always quiet, always the last one to leave. Nobody bothered her. Nobody really noticed her either. She was the kind of student who blended into the furniture, and most of us, myself included, had simply stopped seeing her as anything more than a name on an attendance list. So when her hand went up, Professor Osen actually paused mid-sentence, surprised that anyone was still paying enough attention to ask a question. He nodded at her. Yes, Cadet Whitmore. She lowered her hand slowly, and in a voice that did not shake at all, she said 5 words that changed the rest of my time at that academy. I walked Earth barefoot. For a moment nobody reacted, because nobody understood what she meant. Then it clicked, one student at a time, like a wave of realization moving through rows of seats. Earth, the death world, the planet listed on page 4 of our textbook under the heading Unconfirmed, presumed uninhabited due to environmental lethality. Someone near the front laughed first, a short, disbelieving bark of a laugh, and then the whole room followed. It was not cruel laughter, not exactly. It was the laughter of people who had just heard something so impossible that the only response their minds could produce was amusement. A human girl claiming to have walked, without protection, without augmentation, without so much as shoes, across the surface of a world our own science classified as instant death for any known species. I did not laugh. I want to be honest about that, because looking back, it feels important. I did not laugh, but I also did not believe her. I simply watched her face, waiting for the smile that would tell us it was a joke, a strange attempt at humor from a student who rarely spoke. The smile never came. She sat there, hands folded on her desk, waiting for the laughter to end, the same way you wait for rain to pass. Patient, unbothered, as if she had expected exactly this reaction and had already decided it did not matter to her. Professor Osun raised a hand for quiet, and the laughter died down into scattered chuckles and whispers. Cadet Whitmore, he said, his tone gentle but firm, the way an adult speaks to a child who has said something charming but incorrect. I understand you are proud of your homeworld. All species are. But what you are describing is not possible. The data on Earth is unambiguous. Surface radiation levels alone would cause severe harm within hours. The microbial density in an average handful of soil exceeds what most of our medical systems are equipped to filter. And that is before we discuss the temperature extremes, the weather instability, or the presence of large predatory life forms with no known deterrent response to our biology. Grace tilted her head slightly, and for the first time I saw something in her expression that was not patience. It was closer to confusion, the kind of confusion you feel when someone explains something to you that you already know better than they do. I'm not describing what I read in a report, she said. I'm describing where I grew up. The room had gone quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet, less mocking, more uncertain. Professor Osun folded his arms, still convinced this was some kind of misunderstanding that a little patience would resolve. Let us set aside the philosophical question of home for a moment, he said. I am speaking about verified planetary data. Every survey ever conducted on Earth places it firmly in Death World classification. No probe has ever recorded survivable conditions on its surface for any known species. Grace's answer came quickly, and it landed harder than anything she had said so far. Has anyone ever actually landed a probe there? She asked. Or did everyone just look at it from very far away and decide it looked too dangerous to check? Nobody answered her. Not right away. I glanced around the room. Cadets who moments earlier had been laughing were now looking at each other, unsure, the way you look at a friend when a joke stops being funny and starts sounding uncomfortably close to true. Even Professor Austin hesitated, his mouth opening slightly before closing again, as though he was searching his memory for the answer and not immediately finding it. I want to explain something about our academy, because it matters for what happened next. We were trained from our very first year to trust survey data above almost everything else. Direct observation was considered the highest form of truth in our science, more reliable than any theory, any assumption, any old story passed down through generations. If a planet had been surveyed and marked unsafe, that judgment was treated as final. It was not something you questioned in a first-year xenobiology class. It certainly was not something a quiet student challenged in front of 30 of her peers. But she had. Professor Austin cleared his throat and tried to steer the class back toward the textbook, flipping to the page most of us had barely skimmed the night before. Regardless of the specifics of the survey method, he said, the conclusion remains the same. Earth is classified as a death world due to conditions considered lethal to unaugmented organisms. If Cadet Whitmore wishes to discuss her personal history, I am happy to speak with her after class. It should have ended there. In any other lecture, with any other student, it probably would have. But Grace did not sit back down into silence the way she usually did. Instead, she looked directly at the professor, and then, almost as an afterthought, she looked at the rest of us. "I'm not trying to argue with the report," she said. "I'm telling you the report is wrong, because I lived what it says is impossible. I ran across open ground with no shoes when I was 7 years old. I drank water straight from a river more times than I can count. I have been outside during storms that lasted for days. I have stood within a few steps of animals large enough to end a person's life in seconds, and I am still here, telling you about it. None of that felt unusual to me. It felt like childhood. The silence that followed was not amused anymore. It was heavy, uncomfortable. The kind of silence that settles over a room when something everyone assumed was settled suddenly feels a lot less certain. I remember looking down at my own hands, gloved even inside a climate-controlled lecture hall, because my species could not tolerate open-air exposure without at least minimal filtration. I remember thinking about how careful I was every single day, checking humidity levels before stepping outside, avoiding unfiltered water without a second thought, treating temperature shifts of even a few degrees as something worth planning around. And here was a girl, sitting 3 rows behind me, describing all of that discomfort as simply the normal texture of growing up. Professor Osun tried once more to move the lecture forward, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. He spoke about survey methodology, about orbital scans, about atmospheric readings taken from a careful and respectful distance. As he spoke, I noticed something odd. He kept using the word scans, not landings, not ground samples, not direct contact. A cadet near the middle of the room, a sharp-featured student named Dara Voskin, who rarely missed a chance to challenge anyone, raised her hand next. "Professor," she said, "when you say scans, do you mean actual surface expeditions or orbital surveys taken from a distance?" Professor Osun paused again, longer this time. "Orbital and atmospheric surveys," he admitted. "No ground expedition has ever been authorized for Earth. The risk assessment made that impossible to justify." Dara turned slightly in her seat to look back at Grace, and for the first time her expression shifted from skepticism to something closer to genuine curiosity. "So we've never actually sent anyone down there," she said slowly, thinking it through as she spoke. "We just looked at it from orbit, decided it seemed too dangerous, and wrote it off as a death world based on that." "That is an oversimplification," Professor Osun said quickly, but nobody in the room seemed convinced by his tone anymore. I sat there trying to process what I was hearing, because it did not match anything in the version of the story I had been taught since childhood. In every course, every textbook, every casual conversation among cadets, death worlds were described as confirmed, verified, beyond argument. The idea that our own systems had never actually tested that verification with real observers on the ground had simply never occurred to me. It had never occurred to any of us. Why would it? Nobody in their right mind would send an unprotected team down to a planet marked as instantly lethal. Nobody except, apparently, evolution itself, working quietly on a species that had never read our reports and had never needed to. Grace did not look proud in that moment. She did not look like someone enjoying a moment of vindication. If anything, she looked slightly tired, the way you look when you have explained the same simple thing more than once, and people still have trouble believing you. I did not know it then, but that lecture hall was the last place in the galaxy where anyone would still comfortably repeat the phrase, "Unreachable Deathworld," without a flicker of doubt in their voice. Something in the room had shifted, quietly, the way weather changes before anyone notices the first drop of rain. We did not understand yet what we were dealing with. We only understood, in that suspended, uncertain silence, that whatever we thought we knew about Earth, we did not know it at all. Professor Osun finally closed the lecture a few minutes early, telling us to review the assigned reading and promising a deeper discussion next session. Nobody moved right away. Cadets who normally rushed out the moment class ended, sat frozen in their seats, glancing at each other, then at Grace, then back at their notes, as if the words on the page might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. I looked at her one last time before gathering my things. She was already standing, slinging her bag over one shoulder, walking toward the door with the same quiet, unremarkable steps she always used, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if she had not just, with 5 simple words, cracked open a belief the entire galaxy had built its caution around. I walked Earth barefoot. I did not know yet how much those 4 words were about to change. I only knew, as I sat there gathering my notes with hands that suddenly felt clumsy inside their gloves, that I wanted answers. And judging by the murmurs spreading through the hall around me, I was not the only one. The murmurs did not stop when we left the lecture hall. If anything, they grew louder. By the time I reached the courtyard outside the Academy's main building, small clusters of cadets had already formed, all trading the same disbelieving whispers. "Did you hear what she said?" She actually claimed she walked on a death world. No shoes, no suit, no filtration. It has to be an exaggeration. Nobody survives that. I found myself standing near one of the fountains, half listening to the noise around me, half replaying the moment in my head. Grace's voice had not wavered once. Her hands had stayed folded and still. There had been no performance in the way she spoke, none of the exaggeration people use when they want to impress an audience. She had simply stated a fact from her own life, the way someone might mention what they had eaten for breakfast. That was what unsettled me most. Not the claim itself, but the total absence of drama in how she delivered it. A cadet named Owen Ashford, a broad-shouldered student from a species built for endurance work in low-gravity environments, fell into step beside me as I crossed toward the dormitory wing. He had been in the same lecture, sitting a few rows ahead of me. "You believe her?" he asked. Not quite a challenge, more genuine curiosity. "I do not know what I believe yet," I admitted, "but I do not think she was lying." Owen made a low sound in his throat, somewhere between doubt and thought. "That is the strange part," he said. "If she was lying, I would expect her to sound more excited about it. People who make up stories like that usually want the attention. She looked like she wished the whole thing had never come up." I agreed with him, though I did not say so out loud right away. Instead, I thought about the records room, the archive terminal in the Academy library, where every planetary survey ever logged by our systems could be accessed with a basic cadet clearance. If Earth truly had no ground expedition on record, that fact alone would tell us more than any rumor circulating through the courtyard. "I want to look at the actual survey data," I said, "not what the textbook summarizes. The original readings." Owen glanced at me, surprised. "Now?" he asked. "Now," I said. We were not the only ones with that idea. When we reached the archive wing of the library, we found nearly a dozen cadets already gathered around the public terminals, all searching the same keyword: Earth, Deathworld classification, survey history. Dara Voskin, the sharp-featured cadet from earlier, was seated at the terminal nearest the entrance, scrolling through pages of data with a focused, almost hungry expression. She barely looked up when we approached. "You are not going to believe this," she said. I did not answer right away. I simply leaned over her shoulder and read the screen for myself. The file was old, older than I expected. It had been compiled decades earlier during a routine expansion survey, one of thousands of planets cataloged and ranked according to habitability and risk. Earth's entry included the usual categories: atmospheric composition, surface temperature range, radiation exposure, predicted biological hazard density. Each category carried a warning marker, most of them red, indicating extreme risk to unprotected organisms. But when I scrolled down to the section marked Survey Method, my breath caught, or would have, if my species breathed the way humans do. Orbital scan only, it read. No ground expedition authorized. Risk Assessment Board unanimous in recommending against direct contact. I stared at that line for a long moment. Every other death world listed in the archive, at least the dozen or so I quickly cross-referenced, had some form of limited ground survey attached to its file. Brief expeditions, heavily protected, often ending badly, but expeditions nonetheless. Real observers, on real ground, gathering real samples before retreating. Earth had none of that. Just distant readings, atmospheric models, and a note recommending caution so strong that no one, in all the decades since, had ever bothered to challenge it. "We built an entire classification on a planet nobody ever actually touched," Dara said quietly, almost to herself. Owen frowned at the screen. "That cannot be the full story," he said. "Surely someone attempted contact at some point. A single survey, even an incomplete one." I pulled up the secondary records, cross-referencing mission logs from the same era. There were attempts, technically. 2 separate survey vessels had been dispatched toward Earth's system over the following century, both recalled before making atmospheric entry. The reasons cited were almost identical each time. Preliminary scans indicated conditions exceeding acceptable risk thresholds. Mission Command elected to abort in favor of caution. In simpler words, I said aloud, they got close enough to look, decided it seemed too dangerous, and turned around without ever finding out for certain. Dara sat back in her chair, arms crossed, staring at the screen as if it had personally offended her. "That is not science," she said. "That is a guess, wearing the costume of a scientific conclusion." More cadets had gathered behind us by then, drawn by the growing cluster of people staring intently at archive terminals. Word had clearly spread beyond our lecture hall. I heard someone near the back ask if it was true that an entire species had been dismissed as impossible to survive against, based on nothing more than orbital photographs and cautious speculation. It was true. The data in front of us made that painfully clear. I thought about all the years I had spent studying Deathworld theory as settled fact, never once questioning the foundation beneath it. I thought about every joke made in every classroom about how absurd it would be to attempt contact with a planet like Earth. I thought about how confidently Professor Osun had spoken that very morning, as though the conclusion had been carved into the fabric of the universe itself, rather than assembled from a handful of nervous, incomplete readings taken from a very safe distance. And then I thought about Grace, sitting quietly in the back of every class, saying nothing about any of this, until today, when the subject came up directly, and she simply answered honestly. I found myself wondering how many other things about her species, about the countless quiet details of an ordinary human life, had been buried under the same kind of cautious, distant assumption. "We are going to need more than archive files," Dara said, closing the terminal window in front of her. "We need to actually talk to her." I agreed. Owen agreed. By the end of that hour, our small cluster of curious cadets had grown into something closer to a delegation, all of us quietly deciding the same thing without needing to say it aloud. Whatever Grace Whitmore had lived through before arriving at this academy, it was not something any of us could learn from a textbook, an archive file, or a professor's careful summary. If we wanted the truth, we would have to ask her directly, and this time, actually listen. We found her in the small courtyard behind the dormitory wing, sitting alone on a stone bench beneath one of the artificial light trees the Academy used to simulate natural daylight cycles. She was not hiding from us exactly. She simply had not expected anyone to come looking. She looked up when our group approached, 6 or 7 cadets in total, and something in her expression shifted from mild surprise to quiet resignation, as if she had already guessed how the rest of her day was going to go. "Here to ask more questions," she said, not unkindly, just tired. Dara was the one who spoke first, dropping onto the bench beside her without waiting for an invitation. "We pulled the archive files," she said. "There's no ground survey. Not one. Every other Deathworld on record has some kind of expedition attached to it, even a failed one. Earth has nothing. Just scans from orbit and 2 aborted missions." Grace nodded slowly, as though this did not surprise her at all. "That sounds about right," she said. "You knew?" Owen asked. "I suspected," Grace said. "Nobody ever came. Not once, in my entire life, did anything from outside ever land and introduce itself. I always assumed it was because nobody knew we were there. I did not realize it was because everyone was too afraid to check." There was no anger in her voice when she said it. If anything, there was a strange kind of sympathy, as though she pitied the caution rather than resented it. I sat down on the low stone wall across from her, close enough to see the faint marks on her forearms, thin pale lines I had never noticed before, the kind of marks that come from years of ordinary scrapes and unremarkable accidents rather than anything dramatic. "Tell us what it was actually like," I said. "Not the version that sounds impressive. The version that is true." Grace considered the question for a long moment, turning it over the way you turn over a stone, to see what is underneath. "It was ordinary," she said finally. "That is the hardest part to explain. None of it felt extreme while I was living it. I grew up in a house near a forest, and every morning I walked outside without thinking twice about the ground beneath my feet, the air around me, the water in the stream nearby. I played outside as a child in weather that shifted from freezing to warm within the same season, sometimes within the same week. I fell down more times than I can count, scraped my skin open on rocks and branches, and healed without any special treatment beyond cleaning the wound and letting time do the rest." She said all of this the way someone describes a familiar walk to school, calm and unbothered, and I found myself struggling to reconcile her tone with the words themselves. "You are describing conditions our medical training lists as immediately hazardous," Owen said quietly. "I know," Grace said. "I read the same textbook you did. It was strange to sit in that lecture and realize the planet being described as impossible to survive was the same one I used to walk to on bare feet in summer because the grass felt nice." Dara leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "What about the animals?" she asked. "The predators." The textbook listed megafauna aggression as one of the primary lethal factors. Grace's mouth curved into something close to a smile, though there was no mockery in it. "There are large animals," she admitted. "Some of them can be dangerous if you are careless or unlucky. Most people go their whole lives without a serious encounter, because most animals prefer to avoid us just as much as we prefer to avoid them. I have seen large predators from a distance more than once. I am still here to talk about it. That is the confusing part," I said. "From everything I understood, from everything I was trained to believe, an unprotected encounter like that should have ended very differently." Grace shrugged, a small human gesture I had seen before but never fully understood until that moment. "Should have. According to what?" she asked. "According to a report written by people who never set foot there. I am not saying Earth is gentle. It is not. People do get hurt. People do get sick. But it is not the constant, immediate ending your classification makes it sound like. It is simply a place that requires you to pay attention, the same as anywhere else, only with fewer safety nets than you are all used to having." Nobody spoke for a moment. Somewhere behind us, the artificial light tree adjusted its glow to simulate the gradual dimming of a late afternoon, a small automated reminder that we were still very much inside a carefully controlled environment, the kind of environment every single one of us, myself included, considered baseline for a livable world. I thought about my own homeworld, about the layered filtration systems built into every structure, the strict monitoring of temperature and humidity, the way even a minor shift in atmospheric composition triggered alerts and adjustments before anyone had a chance to notice discomfort. I thought about how deeply that level of control had shaped what I considered normal, safe, survivable. And I thought about Grace, calmly describing a childhood spent almost entirely without any of it. "You make it sound simple," Dara said eventually. "But if what you are saying is true, and I believe you, then every Deathworld classification in the archive needs to be questioned, not just Earth's." Grace's expression grew more serious then, the first real trace of weight I had seen in her since the conversation began. "That thought had occurred to me too," she admitted quietly. "I never brought it up on purpose, you know. I did not walk into that lecture planning to change anything. Professor Austin said something I knew was not true, and I simply said what I knew instead of staying quiet about it, the way I usually do." "Why do you usually stay quiet?" Owen asked, gently. Grace looked down at her hands for a moment before answering. "Because every time I mention where I grew up, people react exactly the way your classroom reacted today," she said. "Laughter first, then disbelief, then either suspicion or fear, once they realize I am not joking. It gets exhausting, being treated like either a liar or something dangerous, simply for describing an ordinary life." I understood, in that moment, something I had not fully grasped before. It was not just that our science had misjudged her homeworld. It was that an entire species, an entire academy, an entire structure of careful, cautious belief had built itself around the assumption that comfort and survival meant the same thing, and anyone who proved otherwise became either a threat or a curiosity, never simply a person. "I do not think you are dangerous," I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. Grace looked at me, and for the first time that day, something in her posture eased, just slightly. "Thank you," she said. "That is more than most people manage to say." The conversation continued a while longer, quieter now, less like an interrogation and more like a group of cadets slowly rebuilding a picture of the galaxy that had, until that day, felt complete and settled. By the time the courtyard's simulated light shifted fully into evening tones, our small group had grown from curious skeptics into something closer to a committee, all of us aware that whatever came next was not going to fit quietly back into a single lecture footnote. Because if one classification could be built entirely on distant caution rather than direct truth, none of us could say with any confidence how many others were built the exact same way. Before we left the courtyard that evening, Dara asked Grace one more question, quieter than the rest, almost hesitant. "Did anyone from your world ever try to leave?" she asked. "Before any of us arrived, before any of this, did your people ever look up and wonder what was out there?" Grace's expression softened at that, something almost wistful passing across her face. "All the time," she said. "We sent small machines beyond our own moon a long time ago, simple ones, nothing capable of carrying a person very far. We looked at the stars constantly, wrote stories about them, wondered about them, argued about whether anyone was out there at all. We never had proof either way. We simply kept looking, the way people do when they do not know the answer but refuse to stop asking the question." That struck me harder than almost anything else she had said that day. An entire species, capable of enduring what our own most advanced protective systems could not withstand for more than a few minutes, had spent generations staring upward with nothing but curiosity, never once suspecting that the silence they received in return was not emptiness but caution. Not the absence of neighbors, but neighbors too careful to introduce themselves. I found myself unable to shake that thought as we walked back toward the dormitory wing that night, the courtyard lights dimming behind us in slow, artificial imitation of a sunset none of us had ever actually needed to survive beneath. By the next morning, the story had spread far beyond our small courtyard gathering. I arrived at the main archive hall to find nearly 40 cadets crowded around the terminals, some of them from years above mine, drawn in by rumors passing faster than anyone could have anticipated. A quiet human girl had questioned the foundation of Deathworld theory in front of an entire lecture hall, and the Academy's own records seemed to be backing her up. Dara found me near the entrance, holding a data slate covered in notes. She looked like she had not slept. I went further back, she said without any greeting. Past Earth. I pulled every Deathworld classification in the archive, all 43 of them. Do you want to guess how many actually have a completed ground survey attached? I did not answer, because I could already tell from her expression that the number would not be reassuring. 6, she said. 6 out of 43. The rest are built entirely on orbital scans, atmospheric modeling, and risk assessment boards that voted against ever sending anyone down to check. I took the data slate from her hands and scrolled through it myself, needing to see the pattern with my own eyes rather than simply hear it described. She was right. Planet after planet, marked lethal, marked unreachable, marked unsurvivable, all based on distant readings interpreted through a lens of extreme caution. Radiation levels flagged as dangerous without any confirmation of actual biological tolerance. Predicted predator behavior extrapolated from a handful of long-range scans rather than direct observation. Weather volatility treated as an immediate death sentence rather than simply a challenging condition to prepare for. It was not that the data was fabricated, it was that the data had never been tested against reality, and somewhere along the way, caution had quietly become certainty. We need to take this to someone with actual authority, I said, not just cadets speculating in a library. Dara nodded, already ahead of me. I already sent a formal request to the Survey Ethics Committee, she said. They agreed to hear it this afternoon. Grace is going too. I found that surprising, given how quietly Grace preferred to exist within the Academy, but when I saw her later that day walking toward the administration building alongside Owen and 2 other cadets, she looked steady, composed, the same calm expression she had worn in the lecture hall the day before. Whatever nervousness she felt, she kept it carefully out of view. The Survey Ethics Committee met in a circular chamber near the top of the administration tower, a room reserved for disputes involving academic integrity and research methodology. 5 senior faculty members sat behind a curved table, including, to my surprise, Professor Asen himself, along with an older instructor named Dr. Halvern Cray, whose reputation for strict adherence to established doctrine was well known throughout the Academy. Dr. Cray opened the session with a tone that made his skepticism clear before a single argument had even been presented. I understand a group of cadets wishes to challenge decades of established Deathworld classification based on the personal testimony of a single individual, he said, glancing briefly at Grace before returning his attention to the room at large. I want to be clear from the outset that anecdotal experience, however sincere, does not override verified scientific data. Dara stood first, unwilling to let the meeting begin on the committee's terms. With respect, Dr. Cray, she said, we are not asking anyone to override the data. We are asking the committee to examine the data itself because it does not support the conclusions drawn from it. Earth's classification, along with 36 others in the archive, rests entirely on orbital observation. No ground survey was ever conducted. Not one. Dr. Cray's expression flickered, a small crack in his composure. That is correct in principle, he admitted carefully. Ground surveys were deemed too high risk to justify, given preliminary readings. Preliminary readings taken from orbit, Owen added, not from anyone who actually set foot on the surface. The room grew quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when an argument lands somewhere uncomfortable. Professor Asen, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke, his voice noticeably less certain than it had been during our lecture the previous day. Cadet Whitmore, he said, turning to Grace directly, I would like to hear, formally, in this setting, exactly what you described yesterday, not summarized through rumor, in your own words. Grace stood slowly, and I watched her take a breath before speaking, the only outward sign of nerves I had seen from her since this entire situation began. I grew up on a planet your records classify as instantly lethal to unaugmented life, she said. I lived there for the first part of my life, without any environmental protection beyond ordinary clothing. I walked outside every day. I ate food grown directly from the ground. I drank water that had not been chemically filtered. I experienced temperature changes across every season, sometimes severe ones, without any technology beyond basic shelter and warmth. I encountered wild animals, some of them large enough to be dangerous under the wrong circumstances, and in nearly every case, both the animal and I simply went our separate ways. I have scars from ordinary accidents, the kind children get from running too fast or climbing too high, and every single one of them healed without specialized medical intervention. None of what I am describing felt extraordinary while I was living it. It only became extraordinary yesterday, when I realized an entire academy had been taught that none of it should have been possible at all. Dr. Cray studied her for a long moment, his earlier certainty visibly shaken. "And you are asserting this is representative of your species as a whole?" he asked. "Not an unusual exception." "It is not unusual at all," Grace said. "It is simply normal. I am not special among my people for having survived my own childhood. Every human alive has a version of the same story." Dr. Cray leaned back in his chair, exchanging a glance with the other committee members. I could see the shift happening in real time, the slow, uncomfortable process of a rigid belief system encountering evidence it could not easily dismiss. "If what you are saying is accurate," he said finally, "then the classification system this academy has relied upon for generations contains a fundamental flaw. Caution has been mistaken for confirmation." "That is exactly what we found," Dara said. "And if it happened with Earth, we believe it likely happened elsewhere. We are asking the committee to authorize a formal review, starting with cross-referencing every unconfirmed Deathworld classification against actual survey completion records." The committee deliberated quietly among themselves for several minutes, murmuring in tones too low for us to follow clearly. I watched Grace throughout, standing steady, hands folded, giving no outward sign of how much weight rested on the outcome of that whispered discussion. Eventually, Dr. Cray addressed the room again. "We will authorize a formal review," he said. "However, given the significance of what is being claimed, the committee requires more than testimony alone. If Cadet Whitmore's account is accurate, it should be demonstrable under controlled, observable conditions. I propose a practical evaluation, using the Academy's Deathworld survival simulator, calibrated specifically to Earth conditions, based on the very data currently under dispute." A murmur ran through the small crowd of cadets gathered near the back of the chamber. The Deathworld simulator was infamous throughout the Academy, a brutal training exercise built not to be completed, but to demonstrate precisely why such worlds were considered unreachable. Every cadet who attempted it, regardless of species or augmentation level, failed within minutes. Grace did not flinch at the proposal. If anything, she looked almost relieved, as though she preferred a demonstration to another round of explanation. "I am willing to participate," she said simply. Dr. Cray studied her expression for a long moment, searching, I think, for some flicker of doubt or hesitation. He did not find one. "Very well," he said. "The evaluation will take place tomorrow, under full committee observation. I want to stress that this is not intended as spectacle. It is intended as verification, one way or the other." That night, I could not sleep. I lay in my quarters going over everything I had learned in the span of 2 days, trying to fit it against everything I had believed for years before that. My species had built its entire approach to expansion around careful, incremental caution, testing every new environment slowly, protecting ourselves from even minor discomfort before we would consider a world worth studying further. It had always seemed like wisdom to me. Now it felt, uncomfortably, like something closer to fear, wearing the language of prudence. I left my quarters sometime after midnight and found Grace sitting alone in the same courtyard where we had spoken the day before, wrapped in a plain jacket against the cool, simulated night air, looking up at the artificial star field the Academy projected above the open space. "Are you nervous?" I asked, sitting down across from her. She thought about the question honestly before answering, the way she seemed to think about everything. "A little," she admitted. "Not about the conditions. I already know what those feel like. I am nervous about what happens after, if people believe me. I do not know if I want an entire species suddenly interested in where I come from. I understood that better than I expected to. Being right," I said, "does not always feel like winning." "No," she agreed quietly. "Sometimes it just feels like a door opening that you are not sure you wanted opened." We sat there for a while without speaking, watching the projected stars shift slowly overhead, and I found myself wondering how many of those distant points of light represented real places, real people, judged unreachable simply because someone, somewhere, had once decided a closer look was not worth the risk. "You do not have to prove anything to me," I told her eventually. "I already believe you." Grace looked at me, something quiet and grateful passing across her face. "I know," she said. "But belief from a courtyard conversation is different from belief backed by an entire committee watching numbers on a screen. Sometimes people need to see it to let themselves fully accept it. I have made my peace with that." The following morning arrived faster than I expected, and by the time we reached the training complex, the atmosphere in the academy had shifted entirely from curious murmurs into something closer to anticipation, the whole institution holding its breath around a single quiet cadet who had never asked for any of this attention in the first place. As the meeting adjourned and cadets began filing out of the chamber, I found myself standing beside Owen near the doorway, both of us quiet, absorbing the weight of what had just been set into motion. "Do you think she can actually do it?" Owen asked quietly. "Survive the simulation, I mean. Prove what she says is true." I thought about the marks on Grace's arms, the calm, unremarkable way she had described walking barefoot across ground our science considered instantly hazardous, the total absence of exaggeration in every word she had spoken since that first sentence in Professor Austin's lecture. "I do not think she is trying to prove anything," I said. "I think she has just been waiting for someone to finally ask the right question." Behind us, through the chamber's open doorway, I caught one last glimpse of Grace, standing near the committee table, quietly answering a final round of questions from Dr. Cray, her posture as steady and unbothered as it had been from the very first moment she raised her hand. Tomorrow, the Academy would stop asking her to describe her homeworld and start watching her prove it, whether the rest of us were ready to accept what that proof might mean or not. The simulation chamber sat at the lowest level of the Academy's training complex, a wide circular arena surrounded by reinforced observation glass thick enough to withstand almost anything the systems inside could generate. I had seen it used only twice before, both times for standard hazard training, never for anything resembling what was about to happen. By the time we arrived, the observation deck above the chamber was already full. Word had spread through every year of the Academy, and it seemed as though half the student body had found some excuse to be present. Dr. Cray stood near the central control console alongside two technicians, reviewing calibration settings pulled directly from Earth's disputed survey file. Professor Osun stood a short distance away, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Grace waited near the chamber entrance, dressed simply, no augmentation gear, no protective layering beyond what any cadet might wear on an ordinary day. Beside her stood a cadet I had not expected to see involved at all, a broad, confident student named Torv Senik, known throughout the Academy for his heavily augmented physiology and his low tolerance for anything he considered exaggerated claims. "I do not think this is fair," Torv said loudly enough for much of the observation deck to hear. "If she is going to demonstrate something extraordinary, let others attempt the same simulation first, under identical conditions. Let us see what an actual trained cadet manages before we decide her story deserves this much attention." Dr. Cray considered the request for a moment before nodding. "A reasonable proposal," he said. "We will begin with volunteers, under standard Earth-calibrated conditions, followed by Cadet Whitmore's attempt. Anyone wishing to participate should step forward now. Torv stepped forward immediately, along with two other cadets eager to prove the point he was making. I recognized one of them, a heavily built student named Fennec Adair, equipped with some of the most advanced environmental augmentation available at our academy, the kind of gear normally reserved for hazardous frontier assignments. "I have trained for exactly this kind of scenario for 3 years," Fennec said, checking the seals on his suit with practiced confidence. "Whatever she experienced, it was not this. This simulation is calibrated to the exact numbers from the file. If she can stand 15 seconds in that chamber, I will be the first to say I was wrong." Grace said nothing in response, watching him prepare with the same patient, unbothered expression she wore through most of these moments. I noticed she did not look worried for him, exactly, but there was something careful in the way she studied his equipment, as though she already suspected it would not matter as much as he believed it would. The chamber doors sealed, and the simulation began. Through the observation glass, we watched the environment shift rapidly, generating conditions modeled directly from Earth's atmospheric and surface data. Temperature fluctuated within seconds, air pressure adjusted, and a fine simulated mist filled the space, carrying the modeled microbial density recorded in the disputed survey files. Ground textures shifted beneath the cadets' feet, uneven and unpredictable, nothing like the carefully engineered flooring found anywhere else in the academy. Fennec lasted the longest, his augmentation systems visibly straining as warning lights flickered across his suit's displays. Within 90 seconds, his balance faltered, his breathing systems flagged an alert, and the simulation's automated safety protocol pulled him from the chamber before any lasting harm could occur. Torv fared little better, collapsing to one knee as his internal filtration systems failed to keep pace with the sheer volume of simulated exposure, gasping through an emergency oxygen line the moment the safety systems intervened. The third cadet did not last even 60 seconds. The observation deck had gone quiet by the time the chamber reset for its next test. I glanced at Torv as technicians helped him toward a recovery seat, his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by something closer to genuine shock. "That is not possible," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "That is standard grade augmentation. It should have handled conditions far worse than that." Dr. Cray studied the simulation readouts carefully, his expression grim. "The conditions matched the calibrated data precisely," he confirmed. "If anything, we set the parameters conservatively, using the lower estimates from the survey file rather than the highest recorded values." That detail settled over the room heavily. If even the gentler estimate of Earth's surface conditions had overwhelmed some of the Academy's most heavily augmented cadets within minutes, the implications of what Grace was about to attempt became almost impossible to ignore. Dr. Cray turned toward her. "Cadet Whitmore," he said, "you may still decline. Nothing about your earlier testimony obligates you to proceed." "I would like to proceed," Grace said simply. She walked into the chamber without any hesitation, without any visible tension in her posture, the same calm steadiness I had come to recognize as simply how she carried herself. The doors sealed behind her, and the simulation began again, recalibrated to the same Earth surface parameters that had overwhelmed 3 augmented cadets only minutes earlier. I watched through the observation glass as the environment shifted around her. Temperature fluctuated. Air pressure adjusted. The fine simulated mist filled the chamber, carrying its modeled microbial density directly against her exposed skin. The ground beneath her feet shifted into the same uneven, unpredictable texture that had caused Fennec to stumble within his first 30 seconds. Grace simply stood there for a moment, adjusting her footing slightly, and then began to walk. Not carefully, not tentatively. She walked the way you walk down a familiar path, unhurried, unbothered, occasionally glancing upward as though checking simulated weather patterns the way someone checks the sky before deciding whether to bring a coat. The observation deck had gone completely silent. I heard someone beside me exhale slowly, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the room. Minutes passed. The chamber's internal sensors continued logging every environmental parameter, comparing her physiological readings against the same thresholds that had triggered automatic safety interventions for the 3 cadets before her. Her heart rate remained steady, her breathing remained even. Nothing in her readings suggested any distress whatsoever. At the 5-minute mark, the point at which the simulation's internal risk model predicted total physiological failure for an unaugmented organism, Grace crouched down, ran her fingers briefly through the simulated ground texture, and stood back up, apparently satisfied by whatever she had been checking. Dr. Cray stared at his console, then at the chamber, then back at his console, as though expecting the numbers to correct themselves into something more familiar. At the 10-minute mark, one of the technicians increased the simulation's intensity, pushing the parameters toward the higher estimates originally excluded from the calibration for being considered unnecessarily severe. Rainfall began, heavy and sudden, alongside a sharp drop in temperature meant to model one of Earth's documented storm systems. Grace tilted her head back briefly, letting the simulated rain fall against her face, and continued walking. I do not think I have ever heard a room stay that silent for that long. Every cadet on the observation deck stood frozen, watching a girl none of us had truly noticed a week earlier calmly walk through conditions that had, only minutes before, been treated as an absolute, undeniable barrier against survival. Torv, still seated near the recovery station, stared at the chamber with an expression I can only describe as quiet disbelief. Whatever certainty had brought him forward to challenge her earlier had completely drained from his face, replaced by something far more uncomfortable to sit with. At the 15-minute mark, Dr. Cray finally raised a hand, and the technicians began powering down the simulation. "That is sufficient," he said, his voice noticeably unsteady. "Cadet Whitmore, you may exit the chamber." Grace walked out through the sealed doors a moment later, calm, unharmed, her clothing damp from the simulated rain but otherwise entirely unaffected. She glanced around the observation deck at the sea of stunned faces watching her, and for the first time since this entire situation began, I saw something close to amusement cross her expression, quiet and brief. "I told you," she said simply. Dr. Cray approached her slowly, studying her the way someone studies a result they had been certain was impossible only an hour earlier. 15 minutes, he said quietly. Under conditions our own models projected would cause total physiological failure within 90 seconds for an unaugmented organism, and considerably less for most augmented ones. "It felt like an ordinary afternoon at home," Grace said. "A little colder than usual, maybe." I do not think anyone on that observation deck fully processed what they had just witnessed in that first moment. It took time, the way understanding often does, spreading slowly through the crowd the same way the murmurs had spread through the courtyard the day before, except heavier now, carrying the undeniable weight of direct proof rather than mere testimony. Torv rose slowly from the recovery seat, still pale from his own attempt, and approached Grace with an expression that had shifted entirely from challenge to something closer to quiet respect. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I assumed you were exaggerating. I have never been more wrong about anything in my life." Grace studied him for a moment before offering a small, tired smile. "It happens often," she said. "I stopped expecting people to believe me a long time ago." Dr. Cray turned toward the observation deck, addressing the gathered cadets and faculty in a voice far more subdued than the confident tone he had used to open the ethics hearing the previous day. "What we have witnessed today," he said slowly, "does not simply challenge Earth's classification. It challenges the entire methodology this Academy has relied upon to determine habitability across every disputed world in our records. I will be recommending a full review, effective immediately." As the chamber lights dimmed and cadets began filing slowly out of the observation deck, still murmuring among themselves, I found myself standing near the glass, watching Grace speak quietly with one of the recovery technicians, entirely unaware, or perhaps simply unconcerned, with the fact that she had just permanently altered how an entire academy understood the galaxy around it. I had walked into that observation deck expecting, at most, a demonstration. What I walked out with was the uncomfortable, undeniable understanding that everything I had been taught to fear about certain worlds said far more about our own caution than it ever had about those worlds themselves. Word of what happened in that chamber did not stay contained within the academy for long. Within a week, the recording of Grace's 15 minutes inside the simulation had been shared through every academic network connected to our system, then beyond it, reaching research institutions and survey boards on worlds we had never even discussed in class. I do not think any of us, including Grace herself, fully understood how far the story would travel until messages began arriving from other academies, other agencies, other governing bodies, all asking some version of the same question. If Earth's classification had been built on caution rather than confirmation, how many other death worlds deserved a second look? Dr. Cray's promised review moved faster than anyone expected. Within a month, a formal task force had been assembled, cross-referencing every unconfirmed death world classification against actual survey completion records, the same work Dara had begun almost single-handedly in a quiet corner of our library. 6 planets were quickly reclassified as requiring further study rather than outright avoidance. 2 more were flagged for potential ground expeditions, something considered unthinkable only weeks earlier. Professor Osun rewrote his lecture entirely. I sat in that classroom again several weeks later, curious to see how the material had changed, and I remember the strange, almost humbling experience of watching him stand at the front of the room, more careful with his words than I had ever seen him before. Classification without direct verification, he told the new group of first-year cadets, should be treated as a hypothesis, not a conclusion. We learned this lesson recently, and we learned it from a student who simply told the truth when the rest of us assumed the truth was already settled. He did not use Grace's name during that lecture, though everyone in the room clearly knew exactly who he meant. I noticed, glancing around, that several students turned briefly toward the back corner of the room out of habit, the same corner where Grace used to sit, quiet and unnoticed, before all of this began. She was not there anymore, not in that particular class. Her academic focus had shifted, quietly but unmistakably, toward the very survey ethics work that had once been used to challenge her. I found her one afternoon in a research office near the administration tower, surrounded by data slates and half-finished reports, looking more at ease than I had ever seen her in a standard lecture hall. "You look busy," I said, leaning against the doorway. She glanced up, offering a small, genuine smile. "There is a lot of work to do," she said. "It turns out an entire classification system does not fix itself just because one planet gets reconsidered." I stepped inside, glancing at the scattered files across her desk, planet names I did not recognize, worlds previously written off as unreachable, now marked with cautious notes suggesting further review. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had just stayed quiet that day?" I asked. "If you had let the lecture continue without raising your hand?" Grace considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I used to stay quiet all the time," she said. "It felt easier, safer, in a strange way, even though nothing about staying quiet actually protected anyone from being wrong. I do not think I decided to speak up that day because I wanted to change anything large. I just could not sit there and listen to someone confidently describe my childhood as impossible. That single sentence changed more than I think either of us expected," I said. She looked down at the files on her desk, thoughtful. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe it just gave everyone permission to ask a question they should have been asking a long time ago. I do not think I did anything remarkable. I just happened to be in the room when the question finally got asked out loud." I did not entirely agree with her modesty, though I understood why she framed it that way. Whatever her intentions had been, the effect was undeniable. An academy built on the assumption that comfort and survival meant the same thing had been forced to confront the difference, publicly, uncomfortably, and in front of an audience large enough that it could not simply be forgotten. There was something else, though, something that lingered in my mind long after that conversation, something I do not think any of us fully grasped in the early days of the story spreading. Earth had never sent anyone beyond its own system. No survey vessels, no formal contact, nothing beyond a species quietly existing on a world every other civilization had been too cautious to approach directly. Which meant an entire population, capable of enduring conditions our most advanced augmentations struggled to survive for even a few minutes, had simply never left home yet. I asked Grace about this directly, one of the last times I saw her before the academic year ended. "Do you think about what happens once your people start traveling further?" I asked. "Once ships start arriving from Earth instead of only leaving orbit around it?" She was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful honesty she gave to everything else. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "I do not know exactly what it will look like. I only know that the version of us people have been afraid of, without ever meeting, is probably very different from the version they will actually encounter." "Better or worse?" I asked. "Just more real," she said. "That is usually all people actually need. Not less caution, just more truth behind it." I have thought about that answer many times since, long after that academic year ended, long after the reclassification task force expanded into a permanent department, long after cadets stopped whispering Grace's name in hushed, disbelieving tones and started simply respecting her as one of the sharpest minds working on planetary survey reform anywhere in the system. Somewhere out beyond the edge of what our maps once confidently labeled unreachable, an entire world continued quietly existing, its people walking barefoot across ground we had once been too afraid to even scan up close, drinking water we assumed would end unaugmented life within hours, surviving weather and wildlife and ordinary hardship with a resilience none of our careful, cautious science had ever accounted for. I do not know what will happen when Earth eventually looks outward the way the rest of us once looked toward it, distant, careful, uncertain. But I know this much for certain now, something I did not understand before that ordinary lecture became anything but ordinary. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is not a hostile world at all. Sometimes it is simply the moment everyone finally stops assuming and starts asking the one question nobody thought to ask before. I walked Earth barefoot. 4 words, spoken quietly by a girl who never wanted attention, that ended up rewriting everything the rest of us thought we understood about what survival was supposed to look like. Years later, long after I had finished my own studies and moved into research work of my own, I was present for something I never expected to witness in person. A survey vessel, small and carefully crewed, finally approached Earth's system for the first time with clearance for direct contact. I was not on board. Grace was. She had requested the assignment herself, quietly, without fanfare, the same way she had done almost everything since that first afternoon in Professor Ossen's lecture hall. When the transmission came through confirming safe orbital arrival, the message she sent back to the Academy was short, almost amused, carrying none of the weight I imagined such a moment might deserve. "Tell Dr. Cray the readings are accurate," she wrote. "Tell everyone else it looks a lot like home." I read that message more times than I can count, sitting in my office surrounded by the same kind of cautious survey files that had once defined an entire world by nothing more than distant, careful guesswork. I thought about how easily it might never have happened at all, how close an entire species had come to remaining a footnote in a textbook, unreachable not because of anything true about their world, but because of everything untrue we had assumed about it. I thought about the lecture hall, the laughter, the silence that followed it, and the quiet, steady voice of a girl who had simply refused to let an easy assumption stand uncorrected. Sometimes the bravest thing anyone can do is not to fight, or explore, or conquer. Sometimes it is simply to raise a hand in a room full of certainty and say the one true thing nobody expected to hear. I walked Earth barefoot. It was never meant to be a challenge. It was never meant to change anything at all. It was simply the truth, spoken plainly, by someone who had grown tired of hearing her own home described as impossible. And sometimes, that is all it takes.